I think I'm good though. All right. Is it working there?
It is.
Yeah, so we were talking about open and relational theology. I I keep saying I keep thinking open and relational theology camp because I've got beer theology beer camp from Trip Fuller on my brain, which
Okay.
I'm doing later in October. So no, this was not open and relational theology camp. It was theology conference in the Tetons,
Mhm.
and it was a lot of fun. Hopefully, you and Marianne can get back out there next year.
We'd love to. I
Yeah.
like the addition of the beer camp. That sounds awesome.
It does sound awesome. I know.
Yeah,
I almost went last year, but it's right in the middle of my son's football season, and it was in North Carolina. But
yeah.
this year, the game falls on a weekend that I may not be able to make anyhow, and
No,
it's closer to Kansas City, so I'm gonna make it happen.
yeah.
And Trip invited me to be a podcaster person. So what are you gonna do?
Okay.
You gonna say
Nice.
no to Trip?
I've looked at a few of his podcasts, thoroughly enjoyed it. I don't think I've had a conversation with him personally yet, but yeah, he's done some good stuff.
Yeah, having conversations with him is pretty interesting. I got to hang out late into the night, a few nights there in Wyoming, way past my bedtime. But I think he and the others were just getting started, so that was fun.
Yeah.
He's not a huge Gerard fan, so
Okay.
but I know he's read my work, and we had some good discussions about it, and
Yeah.
um, I haven't quite got all that dialed in yet, but we'll figure it out.
Yeah.
We'll get Trip figured out. We'll get him saved sooner or later. Well, so this is my friend Andre Rabe, and it's great to have you on the podcast today. And I'll probably throw this video maybe on the Patreon page or somewhere, and I'll send it to you. You can use it however you want. But
Thanks, Jonathan.
yeah, audio wise, we're on the podcast, and Andre and I share some interesting common denominators, not the least of which is we both did some studies on trying to bring mimetic theory and open and relational theology together.
Mhm.
Like on the outside, the idea was basically the same thing.
Mhm.
But once you get on the inside, we not surprisingly, given how vast and expansive both these
Exactly. Yes.
subject matters are, we write about completely different things, plus we're different
Yeah.
people. So so it's kind of fun that um that
It is.
that the world has these resources now because someone's got to take it and run further, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, the depth and the width of what you deal with in the ideas are just inexhaustible. Um, Both Gerard and I've really enjoyed the past few months digging even deeper into Whitehead. And wow, what a joy to start putting the pieces together and kind of see what the relevance is to our lives. You know, what does it mean to my experience, and why are these ideas worth pursuing?
Yeah. Well, what's your response? Give us a reason. Why are they worth pursuing?
I think we are all in this process of trying to make sense of our world. You know, we are all meaning-making creatures, and we arrive in this world, and it's already filled with stories. It's filled with symbols. It's filled with narratives, and for quite a big part of our lives, we're trying to figure out just what the meaning and the story is, and then when we get an idea, I think the bigger question is, what's your part in this story? What do you contribute? Are you kind of just um, swept along with this stream in which you've got really no creative contribution to make, or is there something that you bring to your world that's unique? And I think both Gerard and Whitehead are two thinkers who helps us find those moments of clarity in which the chaos finds an order, and the fragment suddenly sees its part within the whole, and all the scattered symbols somehow come together in a meaningful narrative. And I think it's their contribution to how we create meaning that I find most valuable. It's not even the content or the meaning of their respective structures of thought, but rather the fact that they offer us this counterintuitive way of creating meaning. Yeah.
Yes, that's well put. And the older I get, the more I realize that I agree with what you're saying in terms of, I think us humans are basically, we're just meaning making creatures.
Mm-hmm.
We're storytelling creatures, and we're trying to figure it out, even when we're not like ostensibly doing it. Down deep underneath, we're constantly trying to figure out. And my Christianity was very much a way of, like, for all of us, it's becomes a way to make meaning. And so when I began to read Girard, it started to unravel. And open relational theology, Whiteheadian influenced open relational theology. Yeah, it's a raveling and an unraveling all at the same time. How do you, when you began to introduce this work to people who maybe haven't studied as much as you have, you ever feel like you want to offer an apology? Like, oh, I'm about to give you this stuff and it's going to begin to unravel your meaning making system. I'm so sorry.
Yes. Wow. We often find ourselves in communities where I know the traditional narrative that they've been involved in, and at the same time, I know that being introduced to these ideas were devastating to to my faith and my ideas up to that stage. And so it's that difficult position of, I want to be of benefit to you, but the only way in which I can be of benefit is to totally annihilate what you stand on at the moment. And it's to find that balance where people don't know that you're busy destroying their very foundation of faith until it's too late, and they at the same moment find that there's actually a much better foundation and a much more expansive, more beautiful faith. And what I always know within whatever group we're part of is more and more there are people in these groups who have already deeply questioned the assumptions that their beliefs are built on. And maybe on a superficial level, they have to maintain an appearance of, abiding by the statements and the towing the line of the official narrative of their denomination or their church. But most people who are honestly seeking meaning are already in the process of finding the many assumptions that our beliefs are built on just not worth it anymore. There's got to be a better explanation, a better story than that. And so I find that really exciting, because I'm very often with groups and I sense that there is a receptiveness. I sense that God has already been working way before I got there. You know, I'm not coming there to introduce them to something that's completely new. We are actually just helping one another break through the latest barrier to see what the Spirit of God's been doing in us all along. So that's exciting. That's exciting to be at that point. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. And I will say, I was thinking when you were responding that way, that as I look back over the last 5 to 10 years, really about 8 years for me, that there is a growing, there's an increasing interest in already admitting to having questions, even more than there was 5 or 10 years ago. 10 years ago, you had to, well, I'll speak for myself too. I mean, I had to as well. I had to create room to even just admit that I had questions.
Yeah.
So I do think you're right. My experience has been that a growing number of people are at least, creating space, thankfully. Unfortunately, of course, I think the reason for that is because there's so much unrest and lack of peace, and the Christian story, at least, which is where I know you spend a lot of your time, and I certainly spend a lot of my time, has been left wanting. So that's unfortunate. But yeah, that's a good reminder. And you and Marianne, I mean, you guys travel the world. I don't have very many friends who, live in Africa, but come over to America or to Europe and go speak regularly. So I'm really excited for and proud of what you're doing. How are you noticing, is Girardian or Whiteheadian stuff, for that matter, being received well in different parts of the world, or is it kind of similar? Or
yes, so we would typically get invitations from places where people have already heard something about what we had to say. So if they heard anything I had to say in the last 10 years, they probably heard a little bit of Gerard in there as well, no matter what the theme. And I guess what I can say is that 10 years ago, it would have been, the name wouldn't have rang any bells for most people where I would have ministered. There is a growing awareness. And even if, even if it's not the growing awareness of the different authors or the technical terminology or all of those things, I think the way of thinking is certainly there. More and more people are questioning the logic behind penal substitution, the logic behind the God who is violent. More and more people are questioning the way in which we view truth as something that's just static fact, that you've got to just agree to these statements and that's truth. I think most people are coming to that place where they say, actually, truth is much more expansive, much more creative, much more alive than just having to agree with a preset narrative, which at the end of the day is really just somebody's interpretation of text in most churches, which is so people are already moving to that place to say that maybe truth is maybe there's room for different perspectives, different views, and each one of those views and those perspectives produces a value that is not visible in the other perspective. It's kind of like art. Art is that process of harmonizing all these contrasts and all these elements in a way where some elements disappear into the background and some elements are emphasized in our focus and our attention. And so, although people don't know the name of Whitehead or Gerard or many of these terminologies,
Or my name.
or mine, there's certainly this can I call it a global influence, which is making people ask the same questions, which I think is very beautiful and very positive.
Yeah. Global influence makes you think, could that be called love?
Yeah.
Could love be inviting us? I think that's true. And to be clear, for folks who might be listening, who are at the beginning or in the middle or all along the way, when you talk about truth, I think that's so important. What I heard you say was, truth is much more expansive than words on a text in a text. That's not to devalue the text. It's just to say that truth is never really propositional. It's always it always winds up being relational. And contexts change, and good Lord, the words themselves, the meanings of the words change. So if you are struggling with reading whatever your particular sacred text is, people listening to us, it's probably the Bible. Hey, welcome to the family. This is good news that you're struggling with some of these words, because they were written a long time ago. They've been translated many, many times. They've been interpreted through lots of different lenses, by the way, mostly through white, Eurocentric, masculine, straight, relatively affluent theological types before they ever got to you. So there's room for interpretation, and thankfully there's room for love.
Absolutely.
Love doesn't
brings us into a relationship with the text, which again is a creative space. Even if I think of Jesus being born within a very specific culture, a very specific point in history, Ephesians calls it that the fullness of time. It was a moment within our history where cultures converged and ideas converged, and all of these things brought about a moment of such significance. And he was part of the Jewish faith. And what makes Jesus such an amazing inspiration for many people is that he was not just dissolved by his religion and his culture. He was not just absorbed in it and became a pristine example of what it's supposed to be, but rather he found within his religion and culture the aspects that are valuable and worthy, but then he radically reinterpreted it. I mean, he caused anarchy, he caused chaos in his creative reinterpretation of what everybody believed up to that stage. And he did it using their text and using their traditions and using their popular views, and kind of just opened our eyes to a way of seeing that is much more valuable than what his religion and his culture would have prescribed to him. And so I think following Jesus is not just following those preset ideas, but it is following his whole way of living, which is a creative way of living, which is this way of saying, yes, we want to value whatever we can from the past, whatever interpretations we that's still useful for the future. But God is not so much invested in a past interpretation of the text as he is in this moment reinterpretation of the text. The thoughts and the possibilities, the values in the mind of God continually seeks flesh. They seek interpretation, and your life has that opportunity to be a unique translation of the thought of God that's more relevant than the original Greek and Hebrew. That's more accurate in this moment than whatever scholar or combinations of scholars can come to by just interpreting past text. Your life in this moment has a relevancy and a creative capacity to influence this world that I think the Logos is much more excited about than you just having a correct interpretation of what people thought 2,000 years ago.
Yeah, that's very well said. It reminds me, one of the, someone said at the conference, might have been Bruce Epperly or may have been someone else, I don't know. And I'd never heard this line quite like this, but he said that they said God is the youngest thing that there is. Meaning, and I'm going to take that and connect it to what you just said, as you reinterpret the text and you reinterpret all the past, whatever you've gone through, and you live in this moment, you are becoming God in that moment. And so now you are the newest, the youngest thing that's happening. And that's brilliant because, we all grew up with this idea that God's the oldest, biggest, baddest, strongest. But actually God is the brand newest thing that's happening right in this moment.
I love it. It's so beautiful.
That's pretty cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
We're doing a Girardian conference together, August 19th. As of our recording today, I think we're 30 days out. I'm not sure when this episode will drop, sometime before then. Do you have without giving all of your wisdom away, do you have a brief thought of what you might be talking about on that day?
I guess I could take my whole time slot just introducing why Ted and Gerard are so well suited. I'm trying to kind of find a way of both introducing it, but then also giving a more detailed example of why they are so well suited. But maybe I'll just draw attention to one particular thing. So now process philosophy is, the clue is in the name. It's got the view of reality where everything is processed. Now, our view of reality, when we start trying to understand the nature of reality, we really have two choices. It's either substances that acts, and that is why there's activity in our world, or you can take the view that activities is primary and substances or things are kind of the results of activity. Now, process philosophy kind of takes activity and process events to be primary, and whatever stuff and things we see are the results of those processes. So that's kind of a very simplistic way of saying this universe is a pulsating, living movement. There's no eternal, unchanging substances below the reality of the movement that we see, even the things that we think are most permanent. If you look at the mountain, there was a time that mountain wasn't there. It might have taken much longer to become what it is, and it might look much more stable than all the other things around, but it's also in process. Process is what made it what it is and continues to create it. Now, that kind of fundamental idea behind process philosophy, I think, finds an echo in the way in which Girard looks at the human story. He looks at it as processes, that this process of forming desires, I think mimetic desire is kind of the basic unit of process that he begins with. But this basic process by which we somehow feel the desires of others and duplicate it within ourselves to some extent, or creatively reinterpret it within our own context and nature, that process then becomes intertwined with many other processes. So how does this process cause conflict? How does conflict cause scapegoating? How does scapegoating, that process, cause the emergence of religion and culture? So one can view Girard's whole theory as just the interconnected and nested series of processes. Now, when you know all of this, so I'm kind of just giving you a unique perspective, I think, on how I'm thinking of bringing them together. But then if we look at, Whitehead developed a very detailed system by which processes can be analyzed, and understood in more detail. So what happens if we apply Whitehead's metaphysical categories to the processes within the Girardian world? I think one of the things that happens is it gives us more insight into those processes. But as a summary, I would say that Whitehead's insight into reality is a reality where we cannot divorce the fragment from the whole, or the particular from the universal. So Whitehead's view of reality is a cosmic story. It's got both a cosmology and ontology, and they're inseparable, because the nature of things are intertwined with the whole. And so if we put Girard's anthropological story into the context of this cosmological story, we attain a larger story, or a story where this portion, which is anthropology, this chapter, the human story, becomes is brought into clearer focus, I think, by Girard. He adds something to that chapter, but Whitehead also certainly adds a lot to understanding human consciousness, understanding the movement of desires, and so that's kind of the ideas that I want to bring about, and I'm sure that probably with this conference, most people will be more interested in Girard. But even though I'm at the moment putting the dissertation into a book, I'm aware of the fact that most of my audience will either be people who love Whitehead and process, or they will love Girard. There aren't many crazy people like us that have tried to bring them together. And so I'm working on a way of how do you simplify the Girardian story? And how do you simplify the Whiteheadian story? How do you give a quick sketch of both, and then delve into the detail of where they connect further down?
Yeah, that's really good. I just thought I'd offer a comment when you said something like, I know you already know this or whatever. So the truth is, I do know a lot of stuff of what you're saying, but A, like you said, it's great to get someone's unique perspective. B, the old adage has never proven to be more true to me. That is, the more you know, the more you realize what you don't know.
Yes.
And it's particularly frustrating because I've been on a journey, probably like you, lots of us, trying to figure it out as if you can figure it out. And every time I turn the page, both literally and metaphorically, there's more pages to read. There's more things to learn.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
I can get overwhelmed at times. And so all that to say too, for people who are listening, even for those of us who have like stared at the ceiling for hours on end trying to figure out how this makes sense, you never stop learning. So which is slightly frustrating, but also a lot of fun.
It is. I love Whitehead's kind of whole motivation behind his philosophy. He kind of begins with that all of this philosophy should have its basis in a very careful observation of your current experience. And then you can go into the abstractions and the universals and your speculations, but ultimately the value of your philosophy is, can you bring it back to an experience where your philosophy has given you a new insight, a new understanding of this experience in such a way that it enriches your experience. And I think, wow, that kind of it should be the goal of all communication, that we start something very tangible and we end there. Do these thoughts actually enrich your experience? But I would love to hear a quick also summary of what you're going to speak about at the conference.
Yeah, well, that's a good question. Thank you. I think I'm going to just try to briefly introduce mimetic theory starting out. My time slot will be a little bit shorter. I'll probably go only about 30 minutes.
Okay.
And so this might be helpful for you too, so you know where to go. But I love what you're doing, and I think it's going to fit really, really well. I usually unpack mimetic. It's not linear, but I try to make it linear so that I can give myself and others handles on how it might work. And I usually say it's like a 5-fold movement, but I'm always, not always, but over the last couple of years, I've been more and more unpacking the 5-fold movement against the backdrop of two things. Number one is the reality of relationship, the relationality of the world, which you've already begun to speak to, the interconnectedness and the entanglement, which is what our smartest people have been telling us, and it's what our experience seems to say is true. And then a second piece that I think is often overlooked with Girardian stuff, or for that matter, maybe a lot of stuff, it's this philosophical idea of, well, if you were speaking philosophically, you would call it the lack. Maybe religiously, you would call it like fallen shortness or something. This crack, this kind of break, that what seems to be true about all of us humans is this common denominator that ties us together, is this idea that we're aware of there's like something not quite right inside of us, or cracked, or maybe broken. I don't love that word as much, but just a gap, a lack. And I think that plays a huge role in how mimetic desire begins to grow, because it agitates it. And in fact, if we wanted to, we'd go off on a whole tangent about how it agitates a lot of Christianity, because much of Christianity took that idea of this gap, this separation, this lack, and took it to mean that God was separate from us, which I don't think is true, and it sent us off in the wrong. But so what I'll do is I'll go, hey, mimetic desire plays out against relationship and this lack, and then it goes desire, imitation, conflict, scapegoating, which is a resolution of the conflict. And then the fifth piece is the ritualization, and which you already mentioned, the religion, and that comes out of this whole thing. And that's probably
very useful to know. And I love the coming to the heart, and the assumption of where desire begins is the sense of lack. I was so amazed by some of the things I discovered in Whitehead in the last week about desire as well. He of course calls it appetition, because he tries to identify it in every process within existence, not just the complex version that we have in human psychology. But it's interesting that you can take both Girardian desire and Whiteheadian appetition and locate them in the same space, which is, it emerges in that space between what is and what could be, which is another way of saying lack. So it's that contrast that's being created, and the intensity of contrasts that's created between what is actual and what is possible. I discovered the beautiful portion in one of his, I think it's Process and Reality, where he speaks about how appetition becomes more complex within higher grade organisms such as humans, where it becomes the appetition of appetition, where reminds me of Girard, we desire according to the desires of others, where there's this complexification, and appetite is no longer limited to just the boundaries of an occasion, but it becomes part of an identity, that this is what I want, this is what the ideal that I strive for. And if anyone stands in the way of me trying to attain that ideal, that's normally where the conflict arises. But I think that portion that you spoke of lack is so important. Did you see that somebody just published one of Girard's, I think, one of his earliest books that was only available in French, that basically says all desire is a desire for being?
I did see there was something new. I don't remember what it is, but it is ringing a bell. Yeah.
So I think that would speak exactly to what you touched on there.
Yeah. You're speaking about, and listeners can maybe relate to this, but at first you have a desire for something else because your model presents it to you, someone that you like, presents this idea to you. And so you go after the thing. But what Girard is saying is, after a while, it becomes less and less about that object. And it becomes more and more about like assuming the other person, like becoming the other person, because you assume that they have it. You assume they have no lack, that there are no gaps, that they have it all put together. One of my go-to examples for that is the movie The Prestige. Have you seen that, Christopher Nolan?
I haven't. No.
You need to see it. You'll see Mimetic Theory. I don't know if Christopher Nolan has studied mimetic theory, but I would be shocked if he hasn't, because a lot of his shows have a lot of desire wrapped up in it. And The Prestige is so blatantly, it becomes about, the assumption of the other, becoming the other person. So,
okay.
That's, and if people are reacting, if that sounds weird and like sinister, and it is dysfunctional and weird and sinister, then that speaks to the capacity of negative mimesis and what it can do to us. And
I guess the other thing is, it's mostly unconscious. So if you don't relate to what was just said, I don't want what other people want. I don't have models. Yes, this process is mostly unconscious, and this is why Girard, unveils this very embarrassing and uncomfortable truth, and that is, if you find yourself in conflict with somebody, it is probably because on an unconscious level they are a model to you, and which meant that you adopted similar desires to what they want, which means that you are both reaching for the same object of desire, and that's where the conflict begins. So in conflict, we don't like to hear that we are like the rival. All we want to see is that we are different.
Right.
He is this and I am the complete opposite. But the uncomfortable truth that Gerard reveals is that rivals don't fight because they are different. They fight because they are the same. Yeah.
I'm pausing to let that truth sink in, because that, I think, is one of the most brilliant things that Gerard helps us with. And it's one of the things that I personally constantly have to wrestle with, because
Yes.
I'm the same. Yeah.
It's been so helpful for me in understanding any situation in which there's conflict. And it doesn't have to be, major conflict with an enemy. I can even think if there's conflict within my marriage, what is it that I perceive my spouse as withholding from me? What desire do I see her as an obstacle to? And suddenly, there's a different way of viewing the problem, and it's a way of viewing the problem that helps you find the solution within yourself, rather than always saying the problem's out there. And, if you change, then everything would be okay. Suddenly you realize, I didn't even know that it is that desire that has caused this problem. And why do I desire it? Where did that desire come from? It's been so useful in a very practical and real way of understanding relationships.
Yeah. Super helpful. How do you, oh, well, let me ask you this way. So I think we both would agree that, so mimesis in and of itself, this interactive, desiring energy that seems to be bouncing around in between all 8 billion of us humans and growing. Mimesis in and of itself is neither moral nor immoral. It's an amoral thing. Gerard famously doesn't, or infamously, doesn't expand on the positive side as much as the negative. So we could talk all day, but I thought maybe we would wind down by, I'll just make the comment that because I know we've talked about this before, and we would both think this anyhow, that one of the ways to combat the negative mimesis is to accept the reality that my model is presenting desires to me, mediating my desires, to be humble and admit that I'm not this completely unique individual. That's somewhat of a myth. And so I have to take time to think about who my positive role models are. Who are those models out there that are living in I'll just say a healthy, emotionally, physically, spiritually way. And so if I desire their desires, I have a better chance at health myself. So for you, and I know we just covered a lot of territory, but all that to say, who are your models right now? Who's healthy for you, and who have you been trying to intentionally emulate and be aware of?
Yeah. I remember when that whole process hit me many years ago, when I discovered that others influence my desires. There was a stage in which I just lost all desire. And I think it was kind of a subconscious rebellion to being formed by relationships with others. I didn't want anyone to be part of that creative process. And it happened, I didn't understand it fully during the process, but afterwards I started, and during the process, I started realizing why I had such a rebellion against this idea that others could form my desire. I grew up with such a strong sense that who and what I am is this substance designed and deposited by God within me, and nothing will ever change it. And to move from that to know God is actually in this moment with you, creatively deciding what you're becoming. And together you are creating what you are. And that togetherness is not just the togetherness of me and God, that's the togetherness of me and every relationship I'm in. I thought when I first came through that, and it was a place where I think my faith was severely challenged in that time again, even so much so that I feel that was a moment in which there was a very significant recommitment in myself to the person of Jesus. When I intentionally started thinking, who do I want to be models in my life? I reconsidered the person of Jesus. Well, I remembered what the model he's been for me in my life, but at that time I thought, well, here's a person that somehow found the ability to love in the midst of whatever was thrown at him. And because of his ability to lose himself and give himself for others, what the impact he made. If there's anyone that should be an example, it's him. But then I started thinking as well of my family, my friends. I developed a new perspective and appreciation of the relationship that I have with Marianne, my wife, a new perspective and appreciation for the relationship that I have with my kids, realizing that these relationships should not just be a continuation of an old pattern, but they are creative movements. That on a daily basis, I can look at my wife and not just be familiar with what I think I know about her, but be open to the creative possibilities that she brings to my day today. That there's something she contributes that's never been contributed before. So I guess what I'll say is that instead of mentioning big names, what I want to say is that my friendships with specific people have deepened because I've kind of acknowledged their creative capacity to influence my life. And they might not be well-known names, they are just friends. And
Jesus is a pretty well-known name.
Oh, yes, he is. Yeah, that's the one. But also, so generally, I would say I found a new appreciation for the value of relationships. Now, practically, I guess what's captured me for the past few months is for the past few years is a very deep engagement with both Whitehead and Gerard. We both love Thomas Ord, his amazing contribution that he's making to open and relational theology. There are people that I identify and say these are relationships worth nurturing. That's it.
That's very good. So when do you imagine? So for those listening, you've already completed a dissertation, you've already done all that, and but now you had the crazy idea of adding some stuff to it before you publish it.
Yes.
So and when is that going to be done, do you think?
I was really hoping end of July so that it can go out to be, peer reviewed and be available shortly after after the conference. But oh boy, having given myself on a total focus in the last 2 weeks to try and complete it by July. Now there are weeks in which it feels this will never happen, and then there's days in which I feel I'm going to finish it tonight. This is just flowing so nicely. Unfortunately, I'm at that stage at the moment where I feel it's going to take a bit longer.
Yeah.
But it's imminent in the next few months.
Yeah. I totally relate to that. You feel like it's over, and the next day you learn something new, or you have a conversation, or you read something, and you're like, oh man, I got to insert this. So no pressure. I look forward to it either way. And obviously I've read what you've done so far, and I'm really excited about it. And yeah, maybe conference time, if people are wanting to read it, maybe it'll be done enough for you to shoot some, early iterations of what you think the final might be in PDF form or something to folks. And then that could be helpful, or whatever's helpful for you is cool.
Great. Thanks.
Well,
I would love your take on this one, because there's a lot of things that's shifted.
I bet.
Kind of the form, you'll recognize everything that was in the dissertation is there, but there's a greater width and depth to it. Yeah.
I bet it's going to be great. I think super helpful for our world, and hopefully people can run with it and go even further. So well, thanks for hanging out with me all the way from Africa, and we'll get together in a month or so with our friends and talk more Girardian stuff. If people want to find out about you, is it alwaysloved.net? Is that right?
That's it, alwaysloved.net. We've got links from there to all our resources. So
yeah. So I encourage folks to check in with Andre and read his stuff, and listen. He's on lots of YouTubes and different things like that. So cool, man.
Thanks, Jonathan.
All right, well, tell your partner hello, Marianne, and we'll talk soon. Appreciate it.
Thank you, my friend. Bye-bye.